All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being a part of the 2021 Virtual Christmas Summit, sponsored by Boscoyo Studio. All of the presentations in this room are specifically sponsored by Lightorama. Our next presentation is the Preview Editor and Grouping Pixels by Luke Camp. During the presentation, please do not unmute yourself or start your video, although I don't think Luke cares if you start your video. He might want to see your smiling faces. So you're welcome to use the chat to ask relevant questions about the presentation, since other attendees or the host might be able to answer your questions, but save questions directed specifically at Luke for the end of the session during the Q&A. At that point, you can unmute yourself and ask questions or put them in the chat. Thank you all for attending, and I'll turn it over to Luke.
All right, thanks, Aubrey. Hi, everybody. Good evening for those of you on Eastern time zone, and earlier afternoon to some of you, and perhaps some of you it's night or early in the morning. We're going to talk about the pixel editor and maybe not the pixel editor, the preview editor, and how to work through groups today. Some of you may know me, some of you don't. Just a quick intro, because a lot of us don't know each other around here all the time. I've been around for the last 21 years. Been with Lightorama since 2005. So I know a lot about Lightorama, but I don't know everything. So, and I even learned a lot in preparing for this presentation. So I'm passionate about good design, lighting, and built architecture. And I think you'll see some of that come out today. And then this was something on the template here, something awesome that no one else knows. Psychrometrics is super cool. So if you don't know what that is and you get bored today, go look that up. It explains a lot of the things I think are cool. So psychrometrics. It was something I studied in architecture school. So, all right, we're talking Lightorama preview editor groups today. A lot of what I'm going to talk through comes from S5 and specifically the latest version 5.6. So we're going to talk through why to use groups, when to use them, how they work, how to use them, and then why not just use the use preview all the time, and then how to do some cool stuff. All right, so most of you probably should be familiar with this screen. This is right inside the preview design when you're making your setup in Lightorama. You're laying out your different elements and items. You can see all your elements on the left side. Your elements or props are black. Your groups show up in blue text. So groups basically are just a way to put a bunch of objects together and program them as one piece. If you think back to maybe the legacy version of Lightorama, you sort of had to do everything individually. Whether you wanted one thing or 100 things, you still had to copy or paste everything to every single prop. With groups, you can program AC or pixel effects with one effect, and it will cover anywhere from 1 to an infinite number of props. So they're really helpful in that regard. So really, they're just a way to program more than one element at once. And so that's sort of intro to this next slide. That's what groups are. I think they're a vehicle for programming efficiency. They can help speed up programming, specifically if you have to program a lot of elements at once, pixels or AC, and they come more in handy with pixels than they do with AC, but still the same. They can also enhance some simple effects. So we'll get into this later, but you can group things in different ways and create effects that aren't possible with the basic Lightorama effects. You can simplify programming a lot of times, like I said, especially with AC, and then you can also have some flexibility in prop layouts when you use groups that you might not have when you program them manually. So when should you use a group? I think there's a couple reasons you'd want to. One, if you want to apply an effect to more than one element. And I think most of us have done this at one time. You want to do something to your whole house, your whole layout. You can make a group for that and do it all at once. It's really helpful. If you want flexibility in prop layout organization, well, like I said, we'll get into this, but you can make a group multiple times and of the same thing and organize things differently to have some flexibility in how you program them. You can also make a complex prop. So your prop can be sort of several different elements grouped together to one prop, and you can use groups to program them in sort of complex or different ways. And then you can also override Lightorama's default prop preview with groups, which we'll also get into, which I think is really helpful once you kind of understand how that works. So if you open preview design, you can make a group just by clicking add. clicking that plus button and clicking add, and then you can create a new group. And you have to have at least one element in your group, but you can have as many as you want beyond that. So it's pretty easy to make a group. And then once you get in there, then you'll see this window of how to add things to your group. So first you're going to want to give your group a name, and then you can start adding or start clicking the checkboxes to add the different elements to your group. And there's also an orientation layout, or there's also an orientation column that we'll dig into a little bit later, but that allows you to tell Lightorama how your prop is going to read in the group. And then there's also an arrangement. So you have to select these three things in every group. And the default for orientation is normal. And then the arrangement is, I think none is the default, but then you have to pick one of those. So that's kind of how you make a group. Pretty simple to make. Yep, so that's that. So how groups work. So groups take explicit positions and orientations of a set element and form them into a grid. So basically the computer needs to know how everything is laid out in a group. And so you have to tell it the exact position and orientation of each element. Sort of like I wrote there, kind of like a mega prop in some ways. So if you have two elements next to each other, you have to tell the computer that you want one on the left and one on the right. And that's kind of the second point here, is when you have more than one prop, you have to specify the position, orientation, and rotation of each element. And some of these are default, so you don't necessarily have to specify them every time, because I said the orientation is default, but you have to, when you choose an arrangement, you're choosing the position of all of them relative to each other. So essentially each group is a map of all your elements. And I think for most people, your map is what you see it on your screen, but your map can look differently depending on the group that you're in. So I just want to make sure I'm following my notes here a minute. All right, so the last portion of the group window is arrangement. And so to help the software understand your layout, you can use preview, or you can specify an arrangement. So use preview just uses all your elements as you've laid them out in the preview editor or the preview design window. But the computer doesn't know about your physical layout. It only responds to how you digitally organize your elements in a group. So you can use preview, or you can tell it some arbitrary, and it can understand that because you've told it to it. So I think most of us intuitively will probably use the use preview arrangement for a group, but you can use all the rest of these because the computer doesn't really get how things are laid out in physical space. So in terms of the group arrangement, which I want to spend a lot more of our time on today, is what are three different categories for how groups work in these arrangements. So you can have a predefined arrangement, which Lightorama has 7 of them. And what I mean there is you define how elements are organized in a line. So an array is a point with a line that's infinite length. So you sort of have 1, 2, 3, and it goes in a line. So that's a lot of the top ones. It's either a vertical line or a horizontal line. And then you can also have a custom group, and within that custom, you can define the XY positions of each of your elements. So you could in theory think about this as like a grid back to your middle school math class, right? You have your X and your Y. You can position each element on an XY, and you have to give it XY positions. Or you can use preview layout, which is what you see is what you get editor. It's the way you've laid it out. And we're going to go through some reasons why you'd want to use each of these in a minute, but that's kind of how I see these different arrangements in the preview design window, kind of what they do. So I talked about the different arrangements. Maybe one quick tip here is that as you go through these arrangements, my gut is that most people probably don't use a lot of the top ones because they're maybe less intuitive than the use preview. But this little size number here can help you understand how the computer is interpreting your group. For example, the stars that I have here, they're a star is technically in Lightorama, it's technically a line that's organized in a star shape, but it's really a line. So my stars, when they're in the horizontal stack, they're really, I don't know, 5 stars next to each other, equaling 325 pixels wide by 1 tall. And that's how the computer is interpreting what this group looks like. But if you have a matrix that's 10 by 10, the computer will tell you that the size is 10 by 10. So just use that sort of to help you understand how the computer is understanding your layout. I think for a lot of people that might be complicated. So why wouldn't you just use preview for everything? I know I like to use preview. It's easy. Why not use it for everything? Well, a couple of reasons why you would not want to use that. Well, maybe a couple of reasons you can. You can absolutely do that. The challenge with use preview is it requires the most processing power and can slow your programming, especially with larger displays. So if you use AC with groups with AC channels and you have a couple hundred, it's probably no big deal. But if you're working with more than, I would say, 500 pixels, you're going to start noticing your computer start to bog down, especially if you get to some high speed effects. And so perhaps another arrangement will allow you to do that quicker. The slider bar down here will give you the resolution of preview. And so if you notice a lag when you're using use preview, you can drop this down and it will render your motion effects at a lower resolution, and it will speed up your programming. When you open a program, Lightorama is going to render those motion effects right away. Or when you open a sequence, it's going to render those. So using a lower resolution during your programming can actually be helpful to just speed things up. But make sure you upsize it for a show, because you don't want a low resolution going on your whole house or whatever. So that's kind of a caveat of that. And then I think for simpler group layouts, I would suggest you try to use a predefined layout to speed things up. So the challenge with use preview is standard groups can simplify and correct your setup in a 3D environment. So if you have a 2D house, no big deal. But if your setup spans a corner and your groups might be curved or something or angled, use preview is going to distort how those effects render across. So standard groups can account for the 3D modeling. For example, this is one of mine, our display that I did, and this is a drone shot. And if you were to use preview on a lot of these, grouping different elements, when you render a down effect, it's not going to work perfectly, for example, on this roof or left to right, because you have some distortion in how it's laid out. So that's when I would recommend using the non-preview arrangements. And the groups can enable effect options that use preview can't. And we'll get into that when we go to the custom arrangement in a minute. So I am a visual learner, so I want to explain how these group arrangements work visually. So I hope this is helpful for a lot of people. So we're going to walk through this list here and just kind of understand how they work visually. So horizontal stack align bottom. So what this is doing is it aligns all your elements along the bottom, left to right. So your first element's always going to be on the left, second is on the right, or second, third, fourth, etc. And if some are taller than others, that's okay. Lightorama is just going to clip. If you have an effect that moves from the bottom to the top, it's going to go here. And then once it gets here, you're not going to see it on the other ones. It's just going to be on this top one. So it's kind of what you see is what you get, left to right, horizontal stack align bottoms. So a good use case for this would be some trees like this, for example, or ground mounted, maybe like some mini trees or some poles that are organized kind of in a line. Horizontal stack align tops, same thing, but it's aligned to the top instead of the bottom. Same left to right layout. This I think is useful for suspended items, like for example, icicles. Not so much for a lot. I think that's probably one of the better use cases for it. Horizontal stack, vertical fill. To me, this concept is a little confusing. I like to insert the word stretch. Basically what it's going to do is it's going to fill these props and make them all the same height. So you take this tree, sort of stretch it up, and then when you apply an effect, it'll actually be somewhat distorted on them if your trees are laid out like this, because your effect is going to get to the top here, but it's going to get to the top here. So if you're in a line like this, trees in a line, I wouldn't recommend using vertical fill. But for something like windows, where maybe your windows aren't all the same on the same line, but they're around your house and you want them to fill consistently, this would be a great option to use for a bunch of windows. Again, it's still going to render from left to right, but it's going to sort of equalize all the heights out. And then vertical stack, I just put these together because they take up a lot of real estate. But vertical stack is going to do the same thing that horizontal stack does, just in a vertical sense. So it's going to go bottom to top. And then horizontal stack, vertical fill, kind of the same idea, but it's going to stretch those as well. So you can kind of see how I stretch that on the left side. So again, a use case for that might be some varying sized elements that are vertically stacked. I think this one's maybe a little more hard for me to understand, like a great use case, but like a snowflakes like this might make sense. All right, then let's go to the next one, which is custom. And so custom, if we go back to, let me just jump back a slide to up to, where's my slide? This one. We talked about defined X, Y positions. So these first ones are predefined arrays. They go up or right. The custom is going to give you defined X, Y positions. Let me just jump back here. So your preview layout doesn't matter for a custom group. So this is a good use case for a custom would be identical effects across a group of elements. So let me explain that a little bit. So let's say you have all these snowflakes and you want to apply the same effect, maybe like a burst from the center outside to all these snowflakes. You can actually organize them in a custom group where you align all the centers in the XY plane, and then you can do that effect on the group, and it will render that way. None of the groups are going to allow you to render that way unless you were to do the effect individually on each of them. So that's a great use case for this group. It would actually be nice if Lightorama would make a group arrangement that was maybe centered. So you could have, it would be like vertically and horizontally, but that doesn't exist. So custom would be a great way to do that. Like I said, this ignores the layout, how you have it set up in your preview design. As do all of these first couple. They ignore your layout. They just take how you've ordered them in the preview design window. So that's custom, and then use preview is what you see is what you get. However you laid it out, that's how Lightorama is going to render it. With pixels or AC, you get what you get. So I put this slide together as a use case scenario of just when you might use each of the different group arrangements. And just to note, the nested one is supposed to be for items nested inside of each other, but it's currently broken as of today. I recently talked to Matt, so that's broken, but that would be for things inside of each other, potentially for where you'd want effects to go out. So hopefully that's helpful if you want to take a screenshot or something when you might use them, or come back and visit this presentation. But that's where I think you can use a lot of these different group arrangements. All right, we got about 5 or 8 minutes left. I'm going to give some time for questions at the end. Some cool stuff for time savers that I found as I've gone through groups. Make a few arrangements of the same element and control them differently. So because groups can ignore the layout in your preview design, you can sort of tell the computer something different than what you've laid out, and it can render it no problem. So one example of this is I'm going to pull up the sequence editor here. I have 5 nested stars that I'll just show you here in the preview design. 5 nested stars here that I put into 6 different groups. And you can do the same effect. So I have 3 or 4 different groups with the same effect, and you can see how they render differently. So this is stars horizontal stack align bottom. So all the stars are aligned, and it's basically just doing the bars effect from left to right. And so it's going to go the outside, then the inside, then the next one, and then the next one to the inside. And you kind of see how it's just going around. And I know this might be a little laggy on some of yours, but that it's basically going from outside to inside. This next one is aligning the tops. It's horizontal stack aligned tops instead of aligned bottoms. And you can see how this effect looks a little different. This one is horizontal stack vertical. And this one is going to do actually pretty similar to horizontal stack aligned bottoms because they're sort of actually laid out the same because they're only 1 pixel high. But another thing you can do, this is, I think, horizontal stack aligned tops. This is, it's starting at one point and then horizontal stack aligned tops. So it's stacking them vertically, aligning the tops, and you can kind of see how that looks a lot different than the other one did. So, and then I think I have a couple of other ones where I have some different effects on. So I guess the gist here is that you can do a lot with different groups of the same set of props just by laying them out a little bit differently. The other thing I could have done is in this group, I could have ordered them a little differently. Instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you could order them 5, 3, 2, 4, 1 or something, and you can get some different effects to come out of that. And then I guess one thing I covered before was that you can override the use preview. So a typical star from Lightorama's perspective is one line of pixels, but if you put them in a group and use preview, you can do an effect like this where it renders across the whole star, kind of like you would imagine, but you can't do that natively with the star effect on a single star prop. So I think there's a lot of power of groups with different arrangements. Another use case scenario maybe is if you want to flip one element inside of a group to replicate the programming. So like this candy cane example, you can see I sort of ghosted the effect behind it. And then if you flip this candy cane effect, you can see how they can do opposite effects or the mirrored effect. But you could also have a group where they do the same effect. So just an example where you might want to use the rotation inside the preview design to rotate or to flip the orientation of something. Groups of groups is entirely possible, and I would suggest doing this, especially if you have like a roof or windows or stuff, and then you can group them into a whole house group. So you can make groups of groups of groups, as many as you want. And then channel layout can help troubleshoot some of the layouts. So I think use preview is pretty intuitive in my mind. What you see is what you get. But if you use some of the other arrangements, especially with more complicated props, there's a tool in the group editor called channel layouts that I'll pull up here that can help navigate some of that. So for example, here I have 2 candy canes. This is a group of these 2 candy canes. They're a 4 wide by about 20 high prop. Channel layout is right up here at the top of the group definition, and it will open up a layout window for all of these pieces. So you can see exactly how Lightorama interprets this. So this is an 8 wide by 24 high element. Even though candy canes are curved, Lightorama reads them as one matrix. So this is another use case where you'd want to use a group of candy canes to be able to get maybe a more traditional effect instead of going up and around. So this can help you sort of understand kind of where you're at if you kind of get stuck and aren't sure why things aren't working. I'm going to go to one of my star ones just so you can see this, the channel layout. So this is what it's doing is it's doing 5 stars, all horizontal stack, aligned bottom. So that's how it's reading that. So that's a helpful tip if you get lost. And then you can adjust the order of group elements for a different effect. I mentioned this earlier, but you can, the way that Lightorama renders these is it's ordered left to right or top to bottom if you're in a vertical stack. And so the order matters, and so you can flip the order of things to change how that works. And then a couple quick tips and tricks as we end up here. I think this is one of my last slides. When you're working with groups, build your preview first, then build your groups, then create all your sequences. Lightorama will by default put 2 motion effects for every group, but if you need more motion effect rows, add that in your group versus in each sequence, and then you can sort of save yourself a little work. So for example, if your house, you want 5 motion effect rows for the groups on your house, add that in the preview editor before you make your sequence, and then you won't have to add motion effects to each sequence beyond that. It sort of does that for you. And then I guess I already talked about this, but channel layout is a great way to validate the layout of that the computer understands. Because again, the computer understands differently than we lay it out. So that's helpful. So in summary, I know we have a couple minutes left. You're in control of how the computer applies an effect. Preview is what you see is what you get, but the other ones, you can have a lot of flexibility and customization. Group layout doesn't need to mimic your yard or display layout. So you can have a lot of flexibility in that. They don't need to match. And then I think the biggest thing here is there's endless possibilities. You can achieve a lot more complex effects with groups than even I can try to describe or do here. So say mess with them, try to experiment with them and see what you can come up with grouping things. So that's all I got. We have a couple minutes here for some questions, if you guys have any. So a couple things. Having a roof outline in two different groups. Great, that's helpful. You can break things apart and then group them together. You can have as many groups as you want. There's a question here from Tony. I tried to make a whole house group that included AC and pixels, but my ACs run a regular network. It would not let me create a group with both enhanced and regular. That's correct. Your groups inherently, I should have prefaced this, but groups inherently work with motion effects. You can't group an AC prop if it's not on an enhanced network. So enhanced network, higher speeds, pixels sort of are kind of all in the same. So you can't really use AC non-enhanced channels with groups because they're going to work on a motion effect. And we'll get into motion effects in a couple minutes, but yeah, you have to use them on an enhanced network. And then does the preview allow you to see the channels used by each prop in a group? Stephanie Rudders. I'm not sure I understand this. Sure. What props technically? The only thing I will suggest is that this node layout, or this is the channel layout, does show it breaks every prop into individual nodes, and then it will tell you what universe and channel this is on. So it's maybe a little bit convoluted, but the information is here. And I didn't define any of these channels or universes for the sake of this testing, but that it would. So.
All right, Luke, I'm going to take it back from you here and thank everybody for joining us for the presentation. And thank you again to Vascoyo and Lightorama for their sponsorship. We're just going to take a brief pause here while we get everything set up for the next stream and the next class. So don't go away. Luke will be back here shortly.